What are the Jazz getting in John Collins? A film review. What does THT opting in do for the Jazz? And what could free agency look like for your Utah Jazz? Find out next on Locked On Jazz.
You are Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Jazz. My name's Leif Thulin. You guys know me by now. David Locke was back yesterday. I'm back with you today. NBA analyst, NBA draft analyst, huge basketball fan in general, lover of the Utah Jazz, assistant for the broadcast, statistics guy. And so don't expect all the geeky numbers as usual that David Locke brings to be gone, because today I got some good numbers for you guys. And I'm hoping to make you guys as knowledgeable as possible for the Jazz's big next juncture, which is free agency. After making a trade for John Collins and picking three players that I'm optimistic about, the Jazz fans should be optimistic like myself. You guys should be optimistic, and I'm trying to make you guys as knowledgeable as possible as the Jazz head to a critical juncture in franchise history. Thanks for making Locked On Jazz your very first listen every day. And remember, Locked On Jazz is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, where the best way to help us grow is to comment anything below. And here's the question I got for you, and I'll touch on this a bit myself. What type of stats do you anticipate John Collins putting up this season for your Utah Jazz? Thanks to today's sponsor, it's PrizePicks. They're sponsoring the show, and I recommend you guys checking out PrizePicks to satisfy your sports craving. If you're anything like me and you like to think about sports and think you know a lot about them, it's pretty fun to look at the projections there and see if there's going to be more or less points, maybe more or less runs in a baseball game. Check it out. They've got it all. So today's show. In the first segment, I'm going to dive into what I believe the Jazz are truly getting in a player like John Collins, beyond the basic stats, and how I think he'll fit into Jazz rotations and what I think his stats and impact could look like for the Jazz. In the second segment, I'll talk about the ramifications in the short term and in the long term of the Jazz having Talen Horton-Tucker opt in. And in the final segment, I'll try to navigate you through the weak free agency class and maybe some avenues I think the Jazz could pursue and try to make themselves better. All right, let's dive right into this. It's going to be interesting. So first things first, John Collins scored 22 points and 10 rebounds in the NBA. Like you are not getting some random player here. That's really hard to do in the best league in the world and be a double-double, 22 and 10. And the Jazz essentially got him for free. And every dayers who listened to David Locke's episode from yesterday know that the new agreements means that the Jazz need to pay some money to not get penalized by the same nature that the teams get for being too expensive. The Jazz would have gotten from being too cheap. So those kind of pinching pennies saying, oh man, why are we paying $25 million? Well, there's a reason to pay that money. Someone had to fill it. And John Collins getting him for essentially free. Rudy Gay, and we got him in a salary dump. The Hawks had to avoid getting penalized financially, and the Jazz got a really good player out of it. And is he worth $25 million on an open market? Maybe not. But could he live up to that value? Maybe. But could he live up to the value of $19 million which is his contract minus Rudy Gay's? I think so. Absolutely, in fact. So John Collins' best statistical season, where he scored his 22 and a 10, was essentially playing the five next to a pick and roll savant and who's navigating it all in Trae Young. Like David Locke mentioned, he will not be playing five for the Jazz for the most part. Walker Kessler holds down that fort. He does. But it doesn't mean he won't be able to be in similar situations. Like John Collins is amazing at the rim. He's an amazing vertical athlete. Will Hardy's going to find ways to get him in those situations. So I don't think you should necessarily be terrified like, oh, his shooting stats were so bad last year and now all we have is like a dunker. That's not true either. Like I don't really subscribe to that notion. David Locke pointed out that he's defensively a 4. I agree with that. I do think he can play the second unit 5, and I'll touch on that in a moment. So the big concern that he mentioned was that offensively he's a 5 and defensively he's a 4, so he's a bit of a tweener. I can see what he's saying, but I don't necessarily agree with this assessment, but I disagree in some ways, and I agree with the overall assessment. But I do think there's more room for optimism for how he will play for the Jazz. John Collins' main appeal is he's a tremendous athlete. We have seen a few guys that have this main appeal push championship level teams over the top. And the last couple of years, it's been Andrew Wiggins was known as a scorer who was kind of underwhelming. And then Aaron Gordon was like, if you're picking that guy fourth up until this past postseason, it's a pretty bad pick, honestly. But what did they do? They converted their athleticism into defense, rebounding, and cutting and playing off the ball next to guys who command an enormous attention defensively. Nikola Jokic made Aaron Gordon look awesome. Not everyone's got Nikola Jokic to make them look awesome. Steph Curry made Andrew Wiggins look awesome, but he defended and rebounded, and that's what his value went up so much. The reason I bring that up, the Jazz are not yet a championship contender, but he can play a role that's more valuable to the Utah Jazz than people may foresee based off just looking at stats. Been scoring 13 and 6 last year. The Atlanta Hawks were a playoff team. He played 30 minutes a game on them. They were in the Eastern Conference Finals, and he was a 16 and 8 guy. And what did he do? He was playing big minutes. He was playing the 3 through 5 defensively, switching, knocking down shots. I think he'll always be somewhat of a dare shooter just because he's not unbelievable. But I've got some stats that could argue he's a pretty good NBA shooter, and I'll bring those to you in a moment. But the reason I bring that point up is the Jazz aren't yet contenders, but they have the makings to become one. They've got a front court of their future that is team friendly, both in salary and guys that really love the way they play for the Jazz last year, Walker Kessler and Lauri Markkanen. So he's got the athletic capacity that Aaron Gordon and Andrew Wiggins do. And those guys were tremendous athletes. John Collins has a 40-inch vertical. His head's above the ring when he's dunking the ball. He rebounds. He can defend. And he can thrive in a new situation, in an altered role. The grass can be greener. I know that's a phrasing that usually goes the opposite way. It's like, oh, the grass isn't always greener, but the grass can be greener. And I think it is in Utah, especially with the egalitarian offense that Will Hardy runs, as opposed to the heliocentric Hawks offense that revolves around Trae Young. Trae Young runs everything. So then who's the second option? Maybe they prioritize DeAndre Hunter. Clint Capella runs a bunch of those lobs. Bogdanovich factored in heavily. Kevin Huerter for years. So I think John Collins heard his name in trade rumors all the time, and he's like, man, this is unfortunate. But all the talk, Andy Larson brought this up, is that John Collins was a team first guy, played through it all, didn't have a great season, and he was still fighting through and fighting tooth and nail in the playoffs. So I think that's very good. Now I've got some stats for you. I told you even without David Locke here, you're still going to get some geeky numbers, and I think you should be optimistic about John Collins for the Utah Jazz, and here's why. In 21-22, so a year before this past one, John Collins was a 16-point per game scorer, 8 rebounds, shot 36% from 3, and averaged a block a game. Pretty good numbers. If the Jazz can replicate that, that's awesome. John Collins was 41% on unguarded catch and shoot threes. That's quantified on Synergy as very good. Okay, that's encouraging. Like we talked about Bryce Sensabaugh in the college ranks being excellent and the best in the college ranks at 45% on catch and shoot threes. Okay, so now you're talking about the potentially best shooter in the class, and now you've got a guy in the NBA. The NBA is obviously better, but that's someone who's quantified as someone that's like, oh, maybe he's not a shooter, but yeah, that's really encouraging. This is also 21-22, 55% on dribble jump shots, which was 91st percentile, categorized as excellent. 69% from the rim as a finisher, also regarded as excellent. That was 83rd percentile. John Collins' shooting was also significantly marred in that year by breaking his right ring finger and shooting 12% from 3 in March after that happened, and then worse numbers in January and February as well. And I looked back through all the records of when he injured his finger, mid-January. So before then, he was above 36%, and it decreased. You could argue regression to the mean. I think when you're shooting as a right-hander with your right ring finger broken and horribly swollen, if you guys have seen that photo on Twitter, that makes a difference. That makes an enormous difference. So now why is that good to know for the Jazz? Because this rendition of the Hawks, after they made the Eastern Conference Finals and came back to reality, the role that Collins played for this team will be closer to how I envision him playing for Will Hardy, as opposed to the one that played last year. It's because John Collins played a supplementary role that he thought was going to be conducive to winning. He played a stretch 4 because they had a true center. He played the backup 5 minutes and played defensively as a 5, and that was where he was left a little bit for worse for wear because he was playing a lot of minutes defending on the perimeter and then doing so on the interior. That's just a lot of pressure. So now the Jazz have Kelly Olynyk, probably still going to be on the team. Taylor Hendricks figures to get some backup 5 minutes. And I think John Collins will play the starting power forward and the backup 5 minutes quite frequently. And they'll have enough length to complement him, both as a rim protector with Kessler, obviously, but also with Hendricks and Olynyk as players that he will play alongside. And I think he could really thrive as a secondary scorer, tertiary scorer, and then one of the primary scorers in the second unit. John Collins, I think Will Hardy's going to be a match made in heaven for him. because he encourages players to find their superpower, their super strength, what makes them awesome and makes them tick. And he's going to find that for Collins. I think Collins will exploit a lot of players for kind of sleeping on what he was and versus what he is showing last year, and then what he's going to be this year. Collins can impact the game on both ends using traits like Gordon Wiggins did as a defender, and by all accounts, he's super very team first. And I think fresh starts can be great. And that's what was the case for Wiggins and Gordon. And I think he's in that echelon of athleticism where offensively he can make an impact attack on the rim with that type of athleticism, cutting off the ball, attacking closeouts. But defensively, I think he could be a terror that he's yet to become, that if he's incentivized that way as the Jazz progress as a team. Collins can be a rim protector, a perimeter defender who will add rebounding to the Jazz when they struggled struggled protecting their offensive glass, getting defensive rebounds in the second unit. I think he'll be very good in that. And then I think he's an inside-outside threat to score and complement Lowry. And then the other thing is he's a tremendous athlete. Lowry's a tremendous athlete. Walker Kessler, they all run like deer. Like he should add an element of athleticism, especially if the Jazz play with Colin Sexton. I'd be interested to see if the Jazz run more than they have. Lastly, Collins provides lineup versatility, plays the 4 and the 5, can play multiple lineups. He can play the stretch 4 or the athlete, the dunker spot role, and be someone who's familiar with having the ball in his hands. Collins, I said I'd give you a prediction for his statistics. I think he's going to score about 16 points on good efficiency, snare 7 rebounds per game because the Jazz have a lot of guys who can get rebounds. And I expect a new start where players, like a player's coach like Will Hardy, really incentivizes him to dig into what his positive traits are and focus less on what has marred him, which a lot of it was negative, just feeling about playing for Atlanta as he's, told he's going to be traded for 2 years and what a bad contract he's on. I think he'll play more freely and the Jazz will be able to play big, and he'll punish smaller players because they're going to put some length on Markkanen. They're going to play the true center on Kessler. I think there's a way that Collins will thrive on a high-low situation where he's going to be baseline cutting, much like Aaron Gordon was. He can use his size and athleticism to make an impact. And I think the Gordon comparison, even though that was a championship team, the Jazz aren't yet that, could be apt. And I think he's going to really improve the way he's regarded as a player in the NBA. I'm not sure in a vacuum that people wouldn't have said before the season that Collins wasn't the better player than Gordon. In fact, I probably would have. So, that's recency bias changes a lot of things, but I think he's going to have a positive ascension in a similar fashion, like playing straight to his strengths of athleticism, size, and coordination near the rim. Coming up next, I'll break down THT's opting in, what it could mean for the future of the Jazz, backcourt, and more. But first, a word from PrizePicks. PrizePicks is something I've used before and something I highly recommend and something I'll use again. How does it work? Pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePick projections, you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. No competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. PrizePicks offers projections in any sport that you can watch. This includes NBA, NFL, MLB, NHL, PGA, college football, college basketball, women's college basketball, soccer, WNBA, esports, NASCAR, tennis, MMA, boxing, disc golf, Euro basketball, cricket, and more. I've partaken in most of those, honestly. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100 back. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks will give you $50 back. Don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Welcome back into Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin with you today in place of David Locke, who will be back with you guys tomorrow, and I'm sure he's got something good cooked up. So look forward to that and what he has coming for you. But right now I'm going to tell you about THT returning to the Jazz and what it means for the Utah Jazz. It was logical. That's the first thing. Like, Talen Horton-Tucker is young, had a chance to really show what he could do towards the end of the season. The Jazz still don't have a clear direction at point guard. Why not throw his hat in his ring and get the safe money? There's a chance he could have gotten a larger role for slightly more money or less money and who knows? But THT made the logical decision. I'm sure his agent was like, okay, this is a slam dunk. You come back, you're going to compete for a starting point guard spot on a team that's got a building roster and a timeline that suits your age and your development of your basketball game. Logical. There's lots of money and it's a place to grow. THT coming back may make the future of Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson a little different. And it may cause a little bit of a roadblock for the hopeful ascension of the 19-year-old Keontae George, who the Jazz have high hopes for and want to play the point guard. Okay. But George wasn't going to play that big of a role regardless if THT went elsewhere. Even if THT went elsewhere and Clarkson were to find a new home in free agency, I still think George's role, at least early on, would still be a low volume role. Like, it's just hard to play at 19 in the NBA when you're learning a position that's not inherently natural to you, despite how talented Keontae George is. So that asks me the question, like, what happens to THT and Sexton? Now we've got our answer for THT. THT and Sexton are a bit redundant, and I don't think either are really point guards. Despite with what THT showed at the end of the year, he was able to score some nights well, and he was able to distribute other nights well, but not both. And he does have that size that helps him. That is his benefit over Sexton. But what are the options for the Jazz guard spot? Sexton has 3 years, $18 million per year left on his deal. And the market would not be horribly receptive to him right now. Like, I don't think you're getting a pick out of Colin Sexton. Colin Sexton scored a lot for the Cavaliers on empty calories. He showed he's probably a 6-man, 6'1", 2 guard last year. Maybe he can run the show and the Jazz play fast and find a way to be very egalitarian in both scoring and in terms of ball handling. Maybe Ochai Agbaji has this ascension and helps him in the backcourt. But right now, I don't see the market being receptive enough, so I don't think the Jazz would trade Colin Sexton. Now that leaves Jordan Clarkson. Clarkson, I imagine, will opt out and explore the open market, get maybe more money. Maybe the Jazz re-sign him. Maybe they re-sign him. They sign and trade and have a contract to match big salary should they go all in and find a win-now point guard. Maybe the Jazz really like him as a mentor to Keontae George, who has some similarities to Clarkson. I wouldn't say they're perfectly comparable, but they're both scoring wired guards. Maybe he's a mentor for the still young Sexton and THT and Agbaji, and he's the vet for the Jazz. Okay, that's feasible. That really is. What happens if he goes? There's 30 minutes a night that open up all of a sudden, and who's going to fill it? I think that would be by collaboration. That Sexton, THT, Keontae George all contribute a little bit, and of course Chris Dunn's still in the equation. So Clarkson's the big domino that has to. You got to see if he returns. He returns. If he opts out and still comes back to the Jazz, that's possible. Or if he's going to find a new home, try to compete in the tail end of his career. Okay. If Clarkson goes, that would allow Dunn, THT, Sexton, and maybe George to all play. Who would be the starter? I'm not sure. The Jazz wouldn't have a point guard yet that would be of equal standing to the rest of their roster. And that's an increasingly talented roster whose moves reflect contending is on the horizon, but isn't quite imminent. So do the Jazz trade to win now and use the assets they accumulated last offseason with Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert trades and try to get a point guard? Like, the rumor right now is Darius Garland. I don't see that actually happening, but that's a rumor. Could DeJounte Murray be someone the Jazz would be after? Could they go in all in on Fred VanVleet? Maybe. It's possible. I don't think that's likely. Now, I think the Jazz are going to take this season, try to develop their youth, try to see what John Collins, Lowry Markin, and Walker Kessler frontcourt looks like and develop them for the future, because that is part of the core future. And then they see, what is Agbaji capable of? What is Sexton capable of as the point guard? THT, same question. Can Keontae George play the point guard? I think this is an exploration year where the Jazz are ahead of schedule still, but not quite ready to contend. So I don't expect a win now move, but I would say the signs indicate they're closer to that than you'd think, because going to get John Collins, it made sense. It was a salary dump. It's an aggressive move. The Jazz making 3 picks that I think fit modern NBA basketball and they have optimism for these players. That's another thing. Like, it's something that I think is important to Danny Ainge, is to compete soon, because they have team friendly deals. They have the monetary and draft assets to make them a contender in these type of deals that the Jazz haven't had in times past. That brings me to the point of free agency. Can the Jazz help themselves in free agency? I don't know about this year. I'll explore that in a moment. But I think the trade is the best way for the Jazz to truly construct a win-now mode. So we'll see how that happens. I mentioned I'd talk to you guys about free agency, and I'll discuss some players I see the Jazz having some interest in and maybe how they would grow the team by doing so. But first, just a few messages for you guys to hear. Welcome back into Locked On Jazz. Leif Thulin still with you, and I'll navigate you through what I think is a fairly weak free agency class. It's not great, but how it could play out for the Utah Jazz. The big names are Cam Johnson, Kyle Kuzma, and with the Jazz grabbing John Collins for less money than what I think Kuzma and Johnson are really trying to find on the open market, they seem unlikely, increasingly unlikely. And then that brings me to Fred VanVleet. Positionally, it makes sense, but he doesn't quite fit the timeline, nor the emphasis on size in the backcourt that I think the Jazz are very much prioritizing. Fred VanVleet's a diminutive guard who shoots well, is a solid but unspectacular defender. But the Jazz have had small guards before. They have some still here. And I even though the Jazz would be a playoff team, I don't think they'd be a true contender. I don't think the Jazz want to commit that much money to someone that wouldn't elevate them to a true contender right away, because they've got a lot of future pieces. Like, they've got 3 first-round picks in the 2025 draft that's going to be unbelievably heralded. That's important to consider. The Jazz, the way that they trade into it is they've got these assets. I think they look to trade more likely than they sign a big fish and commit money, especially with the CBA and how the money is important. And the Jazz just signing John Collins, I think they'll make some moves and sign some more money. Maybe it's in the form of Jordan Clarkson, but I just don't see it happening. He intrigues me, Fred VanVleet, but the Jazz aren't quite ready yet to compete. And I think VanVleet's more oriented to competing now. Now, Kuzma, the appeal, everyone knows. He went to the University of Utah. But with John Collins, similar price, similar players, that one seems out of the line for me now. Other players I'm interested in, if the Jazz are going to be, I wouldn't say even buyers, just trying to find players to fill out their roster that would be complementary to what the team is right now and add value. I think Kelly Oubre might be my favorite player on the market for the Jazz. He'll have lower offers than expected based off previous year's output because he was injured the past year. He's a talented player. He's a bit of an enigma, but I could see him thriving in a second unit role with this Jazz team. Like, play him on a quick run and gun style team and let him cook. It's all right. Maybe Lonnie Walker would have a few impressive games in the postseason, which may put him out of the desirable price range, but not of the likes of Gabe Vincent. Gabe Vincent's going to be expensive. This is a guy I've had my eyes on all year for the Jazz to get. And now Vincent, I mean, it would be interesting if you tried to play him at the point guard. I don't think that's quite the direction, but that would be the only way that you could get him as you appeal. You say you can be the starting point guard. I think he's played himself out of the Jazz's price range. I don't think they'd commit their future to the point guard position at Gabe Vincent, but he was a guy I would have really, really liked most of this offseason, assuming that his value would have been what he was, instead of ascending as he was a phenomenal player in the Eastern Conference playoffs. And then he played well in the finals too. They just didn't have enough juice to go against Denver. So that's interesting. One other guy that I looked at that made a deep playoff run. And like I said, I like to build my teams to compete for the playoffs, and I think they could have sustained success. And these are role players. Troy Brown Jr. would intrigue me a bit, as he played pretty well for the Lakers. He's still 23 years old, and he's someone with positional size and the ability to shoot the basketball. 2 things that the Jazz really, really are putting a heavy emphasis on. I had mentioned in a previous episode that Dwight Powell would be a guy that I would be intrigued in, and to be a little bit of a mentor for Walker Kessler, be someone that, plays sparing minutes as a glue guy. But with Damian Jones inking a deal and he figures to get that chance. He spaces the floor pretty well so far. Like, he shot the ball well. He's a good rebounder. He's a good athlete. And then with Collins playing, he'll play some backup 5. You got Hendricks probably playing some backup 5 minutes, and Kelly Olynyk, if he's around, like Andy Larson thought he might be, also probably liable to play some backup 5. So I don't think Powell's one. I just wanted to, for those of you who've listened to a lot of these, I did talk about those players. So no, I didn't forget him, but I don't think he quite fits anymore. As for point guards, that's probably what you wanted me to talk about. Potential ideas that I've contemplated. I don't love any of these, but here are the ones that I think are the most reasonable. Dennis Schroeder. He's about to turn 30, but he's more than serviceable. He competes defensively. He can get to spots offensively. I think his career is more about helping a team win right now than being someone who plays a decent role right now for a young up-and-coming team. So I don't think that's likely. I don't know what the price range would be, because a couple of years ago, Schroeder decided to bet himself and it backfired horrendously, and he got paid like 1/40th of what he was trying to get. 1/42nd, I think. He got $2 million per year, and he was trying to get, he had a deal that was about $84 million lined up. That's, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But Dennis Schroeder's a good player. Another one that I think is an intriguing fit, and this one could be possible, but I would say is unlikely still. Jalen Noel. He's a bit of a shooting guard masquerading as a backup 1. He'd be an interesting player He's been on the Timberwolves for a little while. He's someone that I could see having a good year, but I don't think he does anything that I want my point guard to do that differentiates him from THT or Sexton. And in fact, both of those players I think have more promise than Jalen Noel. One that I actually do like, but I don't know how it would happen because I think the Spurs value him too, and he's a restricted free agent, is Trey Jones. Trey Jones of the Spurs I very much like, and I believe in him as a longtime table setter in the NBA despite his diminutive size. Much like the idea of having someone to be a stalwart like Chris Dunn. This is a younger version of Chris Dunn, and he's probably at the same point, definitely at the same point of their respective careers, the better player, but right now he's probably the better player too. He just played for the Spurs, who are terrible. The Jazz would probably have to overpay, and the Spurs may still match the offer sheet, but he's a tenacious defender making up for his undersized self. He's not quite the scorer that Tyus, his older brother, is, and the wizard with the ball in terms of the assist to turnover like Tyus is, but he is good. He's heady, is an improving shooter, and he's a hound on defense. And speaking of a hound on defense, Javon Carter is the last point guard I would consider. He could be considered the defensive pest. Like if you think of college basketball, Javon Carter is the first guy, him and Aaron Kraft, that come to my mind in terms of defensive pests. I have my doubts on him as for his ability to truly run a team. And I think he and Dunn are redundant, and that there is a pun intended there. I had that one in my notes. So I don't see any of those guys truly being coveted in the backcourt for the Jazz over the likes of Colin Sexton and Talen Horton-Tucker. But if I had my preference, I would lean towards Trey Jones. That one I would actually consider, but I don't know if that's where I'd allot my money. I mean, there's more money to be thrown in and some trades than I see on the open market. In sum, there are some slim pickings at the point guard position. I expect the Jazz to either trade for a win now point guard or use using their draft capital, or come into the year with one of THT, Colin Sexton, or Chris Dunn running the backcourt in the starting lineup, the other one running the second unit, and then you sprinkle in a little bit of Keontae George. And maybe in 4 years from now, I think this is an interesting discussion. Is Keontae George the guy you want in 4 years? Yeah, I think he's the guy you'd prioritize out of that group. But in the rookie year, I think you need to develop him, let him build confidence, as opposed to put this pressure on him to be a point guard and learn the point guard immediately. So it's because the Jazz have the luxury of being ahead of schedule that it's almost frustrating for fans that you're like, okay, just give the reins to Keontae George. Then if you truly think like I do that he's got this potential to be Jamal Murray, or at least of the ilk of Jamal Murray, could he be CJ McCollum? I don't know. David Locke talked about Jared Bayless. Interesting one. So I think he's likely probably in between Jared Bayless and CJ McCollum. That's a good basketball player. But I think he's the guy that the Jazz would probably have the most faith in 4 years from now, that they said, if we're going to choose one of them that we want to be our one, they'd probably want it to be Keontae George, because that means they're going to have the talent and all the positions when they want it as a youthful team that's ahead of schedule. Because the Jazz are ahead of schedule, they don't need to push this, though. And then they can work on cultivating the talent around Keontae George, mold him like a ball of clay, and have him get better. Well, that's the free agency primer. There's some slim pickings in the backcourt. The Jazz could make a splash. I don't anticipate. I think the trade market is going to be more conducive to success for the Jazz based off where they are financially and in terms of draft assets that are tradable. Thanks for making Locked On Jazz your first listen, and thanks for letting me talk to you guys. It'll be David Locke back in the captain's seat tomorrow and next week. But make your next listen Locked On NBA Big Board. Perhaps you'll see me there. Definitely Richard Stamen and Rafael Barlow, who will be in Las Vegas Summer League. But also come see me at the Utah Summer League. I'll be there July 3rd, July 5th, and July 6th. I'll be there soaking it in, eagerly seeing my favorite team, the Utah Jazz, playing right there. You'll also see the Grizzlies. You'll see the 76ers and the Thunder. So there is some talent on the court, and I'm happy to interact with you guys there. I'll see you guys at Summer League. And as always, go Jazz.